All right. So let's get started. Everybody can see my screen, correct? Yep. All right. So
I have a question.
yes, Mindy?
Why is there a giant seashell there?
Oh, I think that is just part of the decoration of the houses. Just makes it look better. All right. So from last week, I did kind of some questions and answers, and you guys said you just want to hear a history, the history of Japan, which I thought was also really interesting, considering that the Olympics has already begun and is running throughout this the past few weeks. So I thought it was a good way to introduce you guys to the history of Japan and kind of tie it into some current events. All right, let's go to the next page. So let's start with the beginning of Japan as how we know it as these peninsulas and islands. So Japan started in what we call the Preceramic Era, from around 30,000 BC to 10,000 BC. Not a lot is known about this time of Japan because there is not a lot of documentations of it. Most of the time, historians use pottery as as a prime example of documentation of the time. So if there's any tools, any artworks, such as pottery, within that time period, they know that that time period existed and how advanced the people are. However, in the pre-ceramic era, as the first era of Japan, as the name says, there wasn't any ceramics. So they couldn't really have any idea what happened during that era. So there wasn't a lot of things known about the area, but what historians kind of figured out was that people that lived during that time were hunters and gatherers. So basically, they hunted their food, they gathered fruits and vegetables and that type of stuff. So they didn't have any agriculture. They didn't have a lot of farming. All right. And also, as I said, there wasn't a lot of artifacts of the era, so not a lot of things are known about the era. And yeah, all right. So after the pre-ceramic era, around 30,000 years ago, we kind of get into the time where there is more people and more of a culture that we can actually see. So the first culture in Japan is called the Jomon culture. All right. So what is the Jomon culture? The Jomon culture is a culture that takes the name from pottery. So the name Jomon comes from a type of pottery. This type of pottery was found all over the place in the Japanese archipelagos because it was one of the most common forms of pottery that is part of their culture. So during this time, people started creating more tools. So instead of using big pieces of rocks, big pieces of wood to build things, they started to make actual tools. So they would sharpen these stones, create better tools and more polished, so better tools to create these type of pottery. And they also started to have agriculture. And also they had what we call pasturage, which is basically animals, so livestock. So they had agriculture and livestock. All right. Oh, one more thing about the culture that is really important is that during this culture, people started to create a lot of monuments. So using really big stones, like the Stonehenge, they started creating these really large monuments as part of their culture. Right. Any questions? Lyndon, you have a question?
No, but just to say that agriculture plus pastorate equal farming.
Yeah, that's correct. All right, anybody else with a question? Yes, Lyndon.
How do they carve the potteries? Do they actually use other stones?
Good question. So you can see from the pottery that it's not as well perfected as pottery we have nowadays. Nowadays, we have machines, big machines, or even when it's handmade, we have pottery wheels to make anything we make look better. But however, back in those days, everything was made by hand. So usually they would get this clump of clay and kind of shape these pots, these pans by hand to make a kind of the shape. So that's why it's not always in the best shape. And yes, they will use a lot of these really primitive tools. So sharp stones to carve kind of these patterns into the pottery after they've fired it in a kiln with some type of really hot fire. So they did have a lot of primitive tools, but as I said, during this time, they were starting to progress to more advanced tools. So they started sharpening their tools. They started to use more of stone instead of wood, and maybe even try to start using metals. All right. Yilin, you have a question?
What is ceramic? The first slide.
Sorry. The first slide?
Ceramic.
Sorry, the what? The what?
What is a ceramic?
The ceramic, you mean?
Yeah, I mean.
Oh, yeah. So what is ceramic? Ceramic is a type of it's a type of material. The material is usually very sturdy. So that's why a lot of people like to make pots and pans out of it. Ceramic is kind of like mud. When it's wet, it's this material that you can mold with. And after you fired it and then let it dry and heat it up, it becomes this really sturdy tool that is really hard. So it's a material. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Yes, Lyndon, you have a question?
So it's two questions after what so first question is like how do they make the clay, and second is that how do they wash their hands if the clay gets stuck on their hands?
Good question. So, okay, where does clay come from? Well, clay is a natural forming material. So you can find it in riverbeds, or you can mix sometimes clay with other materials, such as maybe stone, to create kind of this pottery or ceramic-like material. And how did they wash their hands if they had their hands dirty? Well, usually they would run it through a stream because they didn't have tap water like us. They don't have running water. So their water source was usually really nearby, usually in a well or in a nearby lake or river. And that's where they will wash their hands. All right, let's move on. So we talked about the Jomon culture as the first culture of Japan, and that spanned around 7,000 years. So we're getting more close to the dates that we were talking about with previous empires and civilization. So let's see how Japan kind of compares to the other ones. So during this time, around 300 BC to 250 BC, we have the Yayoi culture. The Yayoi culture is a more advanced culture than all of the cultures before. So it's more advanced than the Jomon culture. And of course, it's much more advanced than the Preceramic Era. The reason why it is more advanced is because, well, how we know it's more advanced is from their pottery again. So we see pottery is actually really important. From the pottery, we see that the pottery they make uses more high temperature kilns. So because we can see like their pottery is uses higher temperatures, we know that they have to have more technology or more advanced technology, because it takes more advanced technology to be able to achieve high temperatures in fires. Yeah, so this is a very big turning point for Japan, because not only did they start using more advanced tools to help them create pottery, but this also leads to more advanced buildings. Like you can see, there's not just primitive buildings anymore. There are more taller buildings, like the ones you see on screen. And although the Yayoi culture is an advanced culture, the other part of it is also the Jomon culture that didn't just disappear. So that's something I want to point out. The Yayoi culture kind of came after the Jomon culture, but there's always a clash. So because the Jomon culture couldn't catch up with kind of the people from the Yayoi culture or like tribe, they kind of got wiped out because the Yayoi were more technologically advanced. All right, any questions? Yes, Lyndon?
Were they living on the same island?
Yes. So Japan isn't just made out of one island. There's a lot of different islands on Japan. That's why it's called an archipelago.
I learned that in preschool.
Yeah.
I have a question still. And what island was that?
Good question. So the Yayoi culture arose in a region that is called Kyushu. That's the region that the culture kind of sprung up from. And what really happened was that this culture was still under development. So this culture, as it started to develop, got much more stronger. So it started to expand, and it really expanded eastwards, so towards the east, because it's more on the west side of Japan when it started. And because the Yayoi culture kind of spread, it kind of overwhelmed the Jomon culture. So it kind of wiped it out, because it became the more superior culture with its more advanced technology and better housing and better agricultural conditions too. All right. You got another?
I still have another question after looking at the picture. So
Sure.
When I looked at the picture, I see like these roofs made out of like sticks or logs or whatever you call them, and then they're attached by ropes. So how do they make the ropes?
How did they make ropes? So, I'm not really sure how they made ropes, but usually primitive ropes are made from one material, trees. They would usually strip tree branches, or they have to strip leaves, create these really long fibers. And using these fibers, they'll twist these fibers up into something that looks like a string that's really sturdy. And that's how they got string. So it could be any plant fiber, tree fiber, and it's basically a weave to make these strings. So yeah, that's another example of more advanced technology. Instead of only tying knots or having really primitive huts, they started developing multi-tiered architecture too.
So it's like braiding.
Yeah, kind of. Yes. Okay. Let's move on. So we talked about the Yayoi culture and the Jomon culture. Let's talk about outside influences, because we know Japan is on an island, but let's try to see, is there other cultures that kind of influenced how Japan is and how they developed? So the most important influence that Japan got was a Chinese influence. So in 108 BC, the emperor of China at the time called Han Wudi occupied a place called Manchuria, which is on the northern side of China. and they established a lot of colonies there. By establishing these colonies, they have a really strong military base in the north of China, which is really close to Korea and Japan. And because of this closeness to these two other countries, it made the communication between the countries very easy. So I was talking about how the Yayoi culture got these really more advanced tools. And one of the advancements in the Yayoi tools is actually the use of iron. So they started to melt metals and start using them in their tools. And it's not only on iron, but also later on with bronze. And the influence of using these metals to make stronger and better tools was actually from Han culture. So from Chinese Han culture, that's where the Japanese learned how to use iron and how to craft metal. But unfortunately, this is only more or less a speculation and a documentation because iron rusts really easily. So there's not a lot of tools that that can prove that definitely it was the Chinese that helped the Japanese learn how to use iron tools. But we can kind of infer that because of the more advanced Chinese technological advancements, the Chinese contact with Japan taught the Japanese people how to use iron and other metal tools. The other big thing I want to talk about in Chinese influence is rice. So most of you probably eat rice almost daily, I would suspect, because rice is one of the most popular and most culturally diverse food in around the Southeast Asia. And rice is actually introduced in the southern region of China, as I said, southeast, in from the region of Yangtze River. And because of this, because again with the Chinese contact with Japan, the Chinese people brought rice into Japan and taught Japanese farmers how to plant rice, which is how rice started becoming a staple in Japanese culture. All right, any questions on that? Yes, Lyndon?
I basically ate rice and ate rice every day of my life. Well, basically skipping 3 years. If I started my life on 4, I'd basically eat rice every day of my life minus 4 days because 4 days I didn't eat rice.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I say it's a staple. So it's a very important part of Chinese and really Southeast Asian culture. And again, this kind of culture spreads from China itself. So in the middle of China, around the Yangtze River, when they discovered this crop called rice, they started planting it and found that it actually makes a really good and nutrient-rich food source. So whenever they travel, they would bring this food with them because food is something really easy to cook and really easy to travel with because it's just really small greens and it's relatively light and it can last a long time. So when they travel and when they start meeting other countries and other people, they introduce these other countries to rice. So that's how rice kind of spread from China to these other cultures. And because, again, rice is such a good food, the other cultures started adapting them as a main part of their meals too. All right. Any other questions? Yes, Lyndon, you have another question?
Uh, like how do you grow rice? Because when I look at crops, they don't really just get rice.
Yeah, so rice is a crop. So it's like any other crops. You have to plant it. You have to plant it in soil. And these crops would grow into really tall rice crops. And you would harvest these seeds that grow off these crops. And if you and then you have to process it. So you'll usually bleach it. You would have to you have to press it, and you have to kind of grind it to get away all of the dirt and all of the outer shell and skin of the rice. And then the result is this kind of white grain that you get. All right, let's move on. So the next part I want to talk about, after I talked about kind of influences, is another part of Chinese influence, and that is part of government and philosophy. So as I always talk about, government is a really important part of civilization. Civilization is built on two things: great agriculture and a great leader. So what is really special about Japanese government and philosophy? Well, to talk about Japanese government philosophy, we have to go back to China again. So Japan first appears in Chinese books is under the name Wu. That's the name that the Chinese gave the Japanese people that they met on their conquests. So Chinese travelers during the Han and Wei dynasties reported through books and letters that the queen during the time in Japan, around the 538 to 800 AD, was called Queen Himiko. Or sorry, Queen Himiko. And this is one of the first documentations of a very famous king or queen from Japan, because Queen Himiko was written down in a book called the Book of Han. So the Book of Han was a book written by a guy called Ban Gu. So the Book of Han was a book of his travels throughout the world. So he traveled a lot of different places within China, outside of China, so he could write this book called the Book of Han. And it's a really important historical text that tells us a lot about the era around 500 AD, so around the Han era and the Wei era. So yeah, so that's how we get most of our information around Japan, Korea, and China from. Yes, Lyndon, you have a question?
Was Bangu a poet?
No, he wasn't necessarily a poet. So he was born into a very wealthy and very powerful family. So he probably was really well versed in poetry. So he probably wrote pretty good poetry, but he wasn't specifically a poet. He really liked traveling. So that's why he wrote this book called the Book of Han, which documented all of his travel experiences and what he saw. All right, so we established that where we get this information, mainly ancient Chinese literature. And I also talked about how there was a lot of how ancient Chinese contact with Japan through the Korean Delta and that region kind of boosted Japanese's technological advancement and taught them a lot. Not only was there a lot of technological advancement, but there was also a lot of philosophical and governmental advancements. For example, Buddhism was introduced to Japan in the year 538 AD. So before that, Japan didn't really have a really strong religion until China brought Buddhism to Japan. And the ruling class of Japan, so the people that are more wealthy and rich, really liked Buddhism because it had a really strong, it had a really important role in Japanese culture. And we'll in later on we'll get to how Buddhism kind of affected future Japanese culture, especially with shoguns and samurais. All right. The next part of this was the introduction of governments in 1645 AD, where a new government and administrative system, so basically a new ruling system, was established in Japan because the old ones they found out didn't work really well. This new ruling system was based off the Chinese ruling system during the time, which was the Han Dynasty. So a lot of older ancient Japanese culture was based off China because they saw how successful the Chinese ruling system and philosophy was. So a lot of the Chinese way, ancient Chinese systems, such as having the state buy all of the land and distributing it to farmers equally and taking tax, was also part of this governmental system that they took from China. Another part of this kind of mimicking of China was in 710 AD, where Japan established their first Japanese capital. So basically a capital city. And this capital city was established in Nara, Japan. How they modeled the city, so how they built the city and how they structured the city, was based off the Chinese capital at the time, which was called Chang'an. In modern day, Xi'an. So yeah, we see a lot of Japanese culture was basically more or less a copy and paste from Chinese culture, with them taking a lot of influence from Chinese culture, from Buddhism, so religion, government and administrative systems, and also a tax system, and also buildings by having Japan kind of modeling their first capital after a Chinese capital. All right, any questions there? Yes, Lyndon?
Actually, I don't have a question. I don't know why, but I like raising my hand and talking.
Sure, no problem. All right, if there's no more questions, let's move on. All right, so we talked about all of this government and philosophy, and the really ancient part of Japan was modeled after China, as I said. But let's move on to more a later time in Japanese history. So after the 880, so around 1080. Let's see what developed and what really changed from the Chinese culture and the Chinese system that I've talked about.
Is it with the ninjas?
Yes, we'll talk about that too. All right. So what really developed in the 12th century of the time was called the Japanese feudal system. The Japanese feudal system is a system where it was usually a dictatorship, so an emperor ruled. And you can see this period right here kind of shows you the Japanese hierarchy, social hierarchy. So who was valued the most? Of course, at the really peak, you have the emperor. He or she really controlled, usually a he, controlled most of the power most or all of the power in Japan. And he usually was the shot caller. So anything he said kind of goes. And right under the emperor is the shogun. So shogun is a military leader. So nowadays, we'll probably call them generals. They were really skilled fighters, and they were really good military tactics. So they also had a lot of power because of the military superiority. And under shogun, we have, under shogun, or kind of beside shogun, we have the daimyo, which is kind of the royalty. So anybody with a lot of wealth or power usually was in this class. Under that kind of daimyo class, we have the samurai, which I think most people are really familiar with that word. So a samurai was a warrior in the Japanese system, and usually they're really highly thought of. The difference between a shogun and a samurai is shoguns usually have more power and more knowledge, so they're more knowledgeable, and samurai usually is just a regular warrior.
I have a question.
Yep, Legend.
So what's the difference between ninjas and samurais?
Yes, we'll get to that soon. Good question. So let's go through the hierarchy, and I'll explain what ninjas aren't on here. So after the samurai, you see this this other tier called ronin. What are ronins? Well, ronin is a kind of a type of samurai. It's a samurai that has kind of left this really sacred culture. So samurai had a really strict culture and a really strict code they had to follow if they want to be samurai. And if anybody breaks that code or doesn't participate in that code, they are called a ronin. So ronin is kind of a rogue samurai. Under ronin, we have kind of the peasants. We have just the regular people, and this is usually 90% of the population. And under the peasants, we have even lower tiers. We have the artisans and we have the merchants. The reason, so the artisans will be painters, drawers, poets. Merchants will be anybody who deals, who trades goods. And like most dictatorships, these people, the merchants, were seen as more low tier people. This was usually because at that time they thought money was a really dirty thing. They didn't understand why you should use money or touch money, just like any other systems. For example, the French system before the French Revolution, with the French Empire, merchants and traders were also really seen really lowly because they thought anybody who had to deal with money and always trade was even worse than just a regular peasant that farms. Any question about kind of the social hierarchy? Yes, Lyndon?
Why are there like these things behind?
Oh yeah, so that because this picture is a cutout of a larger picture, so that's why it wasn't a really great perfect cutout. All right, so I kind of talked about the social hierarchy. So, but let's get more detailed and let's get into more detail about what actually happens in this kind of samurai code that I talked about.
I still have a question.
Sure, I'll answer your question before we move on.
Why is this thing called hierarchy? Why can't you just call it the federal?
So social hierarchy, I'm not sure if you guys know, hierarchy is kind of a tier. So the kind of the higher you are, the more power it seems you are. So it's kind of a hierarchy. It's kind of tier based, and every tier has a different type of people. So yeah, that's why it's kind of a coined word. Hierarchy just describes kind of a kind of social tier system. Okay, so let's talk more about samurais, because I'm pretty sure most of you guys are interested in what samurais are and what they kind of did. Yeah, so you see a lot of samurais in movies. So what are samurais? Well, samurais were members of really powerful military military groups in feudal Japan. So Japan over around the 12th century. And these warriors became really powerful in the 12th century. So in the 12th century, they started gaining a lot of power. So around 1300s, around. And because of the rise of power, due to their military superiority, because they're really good fighters, they started taking a lot of powers in around the 1300s and creating the country's first military dictatorship. Because of their power, they could create these really big dictatorships using their power. And these military dictatorships are called shogunate. So a shogunate was a military dictator or military dictatorship. And usually samurais were the servants of a daimyo, so any of the royalty or great lords, so the shoguns. The samurais were the servants of these people. And the samurais were used to help back up the authority of the shogun and gave him power. Because samurais, so basically back then, whoever had the bigger stick or the larger sword had most of the power in feudal Japan. And usually this means that shoguns actually had higher powers than emperors, because the emperors only have usually the royal guard, but the shogun can get a lot more warriors and train more warriors than the emperor, and actually be more powerful than the actual emperor in most cases. All right. So what else was that the samurai will actually dominate Japanese government and society for a long time. So the samurai supremacy kind of was continued all the way until 1868. So that's a really long time. That was 500 years of samurais and shoguns leading the country. So usually what happened during this time was there's a lot of different houses. So if you had the same last name, you were part of one big house. And these houses were kind of banding together, kind of like different groups of royalty. And they will usually fight for the top spot. So the most powerful family will become the shogunate, or the lord of the country. And usually these different shoguns control different regions until one gets powerful enough to control the rest. So it was basically kind of a warring period where everybody fought for power, but sometimes there were peace if there's a united family that controlled Japan peacefully, but usually there was a lot of fighting for the powers. So in 1868, this kind of came to an end with samurais. So samurais kind of disappeared because of the Meiji Restoration.
What does restoration mean?
Restoration means recover. So to kind of restore or go back to a previous system. So in this restoration led to the abolition, so the cancel of the feudal system. So there was no more of these warlords and shogun system. However, the samurais were actually still really honored, because it was a very honorable job and it had a lot of respect under the name if you were called a samurai. So even though they didn't have the privileges and the power they had before, many of the samurais were still in really elite ranks and elite ranks in politics and industry in modern Japan. So anything after 1868 is what we will call modern Japan, where they usually had a more stable government in either a form of democracy or dictatorship, and there's no more warlords that had actual power. The reason I was talking about was that samurais had a very strict code of honor and a discipline, and a lot of discipline and a lot of morality. And they called this the Bushido, or the way of the warrior. And basically, this code was a really strict code on how to act properly and with a lot of honor and discipline. And this code was kind of changed and used as a basic code of conduct in Japanese society. So thanks to the really strict and traditional code of honor the samurai has, that's what really based off the really respectful culture you see in Japan. All right, so that kind of covers all of the samurais, shoguns, and how emperors kind of fit in the system. But Lyndon talked about ninjas. So what were ninjas? Well, ninjas are really different from samurais. Samurais were warriors that usually belonged to really noble families and part of a noble class in Japanese society. But ninjas were trained as assassins and mercenaries, so they got paid for their jobs instead of having a code and they followed somebody. So basically, whoever paid them, they will work for them, and they were usually in the lower class of Japanese society. They were usually part of the artisan tier of Japanese society, so they were more low tier. But when you think of ninja, you think of movies with evil assassins sometimes, but not all ninjas in the time were really bad. They usually also did a lot of good because they even though they don't have this really strict code of honor, they were still not they weren't bad people, and they were actually just regular people, but they often got harassed by the ruling class because of their jobs. All right. Any question on the ruling classes of Japan and samurais? Nope. Everybody good? All right. If there's no more questions, I'm
I have
going to
a
show.
question.
Sure, I'm going to.
What does Meiji mean, or whatever you call that?
Yeah, Meiji was it's just a name for the restoration period. So Meiji again is a name of actually an emperor, and the Meiji restoration was just a name of the event that happened. Meiji, I believe, is kind of in Japanese was also called the Meiji restoration, also called the honorable restoration, because they believe that this feudal system of fighting and kind of trying to fight for power was not honorable. So they tried in the restoration, they tried to establish more peaceful times.
I don't know why, but I can't hear you.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah. So you said it was a bit scary, and that is correct because again, they followed a really strict code, and this code made ensure that there was this hierarchy in power, and everybody followed it. So that's why they would commit suicide if their masters died or they were defeated in battle. So it's a code of honor saying that that I would rather die than be captured. There is a very famous Chinese proverb called 可杀不可辱, 不可辱, meaning that one can die but cannot be humiliated. So that is a really core part of the samurai code of honor, where they would rather, when they get captured, they would rather kill themselves than kind of be humiliated by being a prisoner of the enemies. So yeah, it's a bit scary, but it's still a very important code because it's still really important because everybody followed this code and made sure that there was still some order within society. And this code of honor that the samurais followed still is kind of in modern day, without the killing themselves and beheading the enemy's part, but all of the parts about respect, humility, and also kind of not being humiliated is a really big part of Japanese culture. So that's why you see them always bowing, because they want to show each other a lot of respect. Okay, does anybody have any more questions on the samurais?
No,
Yes. Nope.
I don't have a question.
All right, that's fine. Okay, so that's kind of it for today's lesson. So, but however, unfortunately, Kahoot wasn't working today. So there will not be any Kahoots today. But I do have a kind of a surprise for you guys. You see on the screen that I have the title Famous Japanese Landmarks up, right? So I have something to share with you guys. Let me stop sharing my screen. I'll share something else. Because these kind of famous landmarks, I believe, is kind of important to learn about, I thought that it is best for you guys to learn about these different historical landmarks. Bye, guys.
Bye.